My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 28 years old, and I believed in people until 3 months ago when my world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. They say trust is earned, but I gave mine away freely, stupidly, completely. I handed over my heart, my secrets, my vulnerabilities to those I thought would guard them with their lives. Instead, they used everything against me, weaponizing my deepest fears and turning my own honesty into daggers that they plunged into my back repeatedly. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, a methodical destruction that began with small lies and escalated into something so devastating that I question everything I once knew about human nature. I used to be the person who saw good in everyone, who believed that beneath every harsh exterior was a soul worth saving. That optimism feels foreign now, like a language I once spoke fluently but can no longer remember. The people who destroyed me weren't strangers who broke into my life like burglars in the night. They were my closest friends, my chosen family, the ones I would have died for without hesitation. Marcus, who I'd known since college, who'd been my anchor through every storm. Elena, my roommate and confidant, who knew every password to my digital life and every key to my emotional one. And David, my business partner, who I'd trusted with not just my professional dreams but my financial future. These three people held the blueprint to my entire existence, and they decided to burn it all down while I watched, helpless and horrified. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself but realizing how long they'd been planning it, how many shared laughs and intimate moments had been lies, how they'd studied me like a specimen under a microscope, cataloging my weaknesses for future use. I replay conversations now, searching for clues I missed, wondering how I could have been so blind to their deception. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March when I discovered Elena had been going through my personal journal, the one I kept hidden in my bedroom drawer. I found her reading it in the kitchen, coffee cup in one hand, my deepest thoughts in the other, her face showing no shame when I walked in. She didn't even try to hide what she was doing. Instead, she looked up with this cold smile I'd never seen before and said she was just trying to understand me better. The casual violation felt like a punch to the stomach, but I rationalized it away, told myself she was going through a rough patch and maybe just needed to feel closer to someone. I should have trusted my instincts then, should have recognized that boundary crossing for what it really was, the opening move in a carefully orchestrated game. But I was still operating under the old rules, the ones where people you love deserve the benefit of the doubt, where friendships are worth fighting for, where misunderstandings can be resolved with honest conversation. Elena apologized later, brought me flowers and my favorite takeout, promised it would never happen again, and I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Meanwhile, Marcus had been subtly isolating me from other friends, always having reasons why I shouldn't go to parties or gatherings, manufacturing emergencies that required my immediate attention whenever I tried to maintain relationships outside our circle. He positioned himself as my protector, claiming others didn't understand me the way he did, that they were jealous of our connection. I felt special, chosen, grateful to have someone who cared so much about my well-being. I didn't realize he was systematically cutting my support network, ensuring I'd have nowhere to turn when everything fell apart. David's manipulation was the most sophisticated because it was wrapped in professional language and business logic. He convinced me to sign over more control of our company, citing legal technicalities and market pressures that, in retrospect, were probably fabricated. I trusted his expertise because he was the one with the MBA, the one who spoke the language of contracts and corporations with fluency I envied. Every document I signed, every decision I deferred to his judgment, every time I chose collaboration over caution, I was essentially handing him the rope he'd eventually use to hang me. The three of them worked in perfect synchronization, though I didn't understand their coordination at the time. When Elena made me doubt my memories by insisting conversations had gone differently than I remembered, Marcus would be there to validate her version of events. When David needed me to make a questionable business decision, Elena would create a personal crisis that left me too emotionally drained to think clearly. They played my emotions like a virtuoso plays a violin, creating beautiful music while slowly breaking all the strings. The gaslighting was so subtle, so consistent, that I began to question my own sanity. I'd remember a conversation one way, but all three of them would insist it had happened differently, with such confidence and detail that I'd start to believe my memory was faulty. They'd reference things I'd supposedly said or done that felt completely foreign to me, but their certainty made me wonder if I was losing my mind. I started keeping notes, trying to document conversations and events, but somehow those notes would disappear or be moved, and when I'd mention it, they'd look at me with such concern, such gentle pity, as if I was fragile and confused. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its cruelty because it made me complicit in my own destruction. I began censoring myself, second-guessing every thought and feeling, apologizing for reactions I wasn't even sure I'd had. I became smaller, quieter, more dependent on their interpretations of reality because mine felt increasingly unreliable. The financial betrayal emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, revealing its devastating image piece by piece. I started noticing irregularities in our business accounts, money that should have been there wasn't, expenses that didn't match my records, payments to vendors I'd never heard of. When I brought these discrepancies to David's attention, he had explanations for everything, usually involving complex financial instruments or regulatory requirements that were beyond my understanding. He spoke with such authority, such dismissive confidence, that questioning him felt like admitting ignorance. I realize now that he was counting on my insecurity about business matters, exploiting the knowledge gap between us to hide his theft in plain sight. Elena, meanwhile, had been systematically going through my personal belongings, photographing important documents, learning the details of my life that weren't meant for sharing. My social security card, birth certificate, insurance papers, bank statements, medical records, everything that could be used to steal my identity or damage my reputation was cataloged and copied. She had access because she lived with me, because I trusted her with keys and passwords, because she was supposed to be the sister I never had. The violation went beyond theft. It was an intimate betrayal that made me feel exposed and vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced. Marcus had been working a different angle, slowly poisoning my relationships with family members by sharing twisted versions of things I'd told him in confidence. He'd call my mother pretending to be concerned about my mental health, sharing stories that made me sound unstable and dangerous. He'd reach out to my siblings with carefully constructed lies about my behavior, painting himself as the long-suffering friend trying to help someone who was spiraling out of control. By the time I realized what he was doing, the damage was extensive. My family viewed me with suspicion and worry, unsure what to believe but certain something was wrong. The web of lies began unraveling on a Friday evening in June when I received a call from my bank about suspicious activity on my account. Someone had attempted to transfer a significant sum of money to an overseas account, a transaction that had been flagged for review. The caller mentioned that the attempt had come from my own computer, from my home IP address, which should have been impossible since I'd been at work all day. Elena had been home alone, claiming she was sick with a migraine that kept her in bed. The pieces started clicking together with sickening clarity. I rushed home to find her gone, along with several of my personal items, my laptop, and a folder of important documents I kept in my bedroom safe. She'd known the combination because I'd shared it with her years earlier during a moment of complete trust, never imagining she'd use that knowledge against me. The betrayal felt physical, like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged my organs, leaving everything in the wrong place. I called Marcus immediately, needing someone to talk to, someone who would help me make sense of what was happening. His phone went straight to voicemail, which was unusual since he always answered my calls. I tried reaching David, but he didn't respond either. The silence from both of them felt ominous, like the calm before a storm I could sense approaching but couldn't yet see. Over the next few hours, I tried to piece together what had happened. Elena had left no note, no explanation, nothing but empty drawers and missing belongings. I checked my email and found that several accounts had been accessed from an unknown device, my passwords apparently compromised. Social media profiles I hadn't used in years had been activated and used to send strange messages to old friends and acquaintances. Someone had been systematically trying to make me look unstable, unreliable, dangerous even. The sophistication of the attack became clear as I dug deeper into the digital forensics of my own life. My phone started ringing with calls from confused friends and former colleagues who'd received bizarre messages from my accounts. Some had gotten rambling emails about persecution and conspiracy theories. Others had received social media messages that were flirtatious and inappropriate, completely out of character for me. A few had been contacted by someone claiming to be me, asking for money or favors or sharing embarrassing personal information that only I should have known. The campaign to destroy my reputation was thorough and devastating. I spent hours that night calling people back, trying to explain that my accounts had been compromised, that someone was impersonating me, but the damage was already done. Even those who believed me now viewed me with a mixture of pity and concern, wondering how I'd let my life become such a mess. The professional consequences began immediately. By Monday morning, I was getting calls from clients who'd received strange communications from my business email account. David, my trusted partner, had apparently sent several messages over the weekend that portrayed our company in a terrible light, suggesting we were on the verge of bankruptcy and couldn't fulfill our obligations. When I tried to reach him to understand what was happening, I discovered that he'd changed all the passwords to our shared accounts and locked me out of the business I'd helped build from nothing. The company I'd poured my heart and soul into, the dream I'd worked 18-hour days to realize, was suddenly beyond my reach. My key card no longer worked at the office building. My name had been removed from the lease and the business registration. Legally, I'd been erased from my own company overnight. The lawyers I consulted told me that the documents I'd signed over the years, the ones David had presented as routine business paperwork, had actually been transferring ownership and control to him piece by piece. I'd essentially given away my own company without realizing it, trusting someone who'd been planning to steal it from the beginning. The legal battle would be expensive and difficult, with no guarantee of success, especially given the compromised state of my finances and reputation. Marcus finally called me back Tuesday evening, but the conversation felt wrong from the first word. His voice had a coldness I'd never heard before, a distance that made him sound like a stranger wearing my best friend's vocal cords. He claimed he'd been busy with family issues, but when I told him about Elena's disappearance and the financial attacks, his response was eerily calm. He didn't seem surprised or concerned, didn't offer to help or even ask if I was okay. Instead, he began questioning my version of events, suggesting that maybe Elena had good reasons for leaving, that maybe I wasn't seeing the situation clearly. The gaslighting that had been subtle before became blatant and cruel. He implied that my stress and paranoia were causing me to imagine connections that didn't exist, to blame others for problems I'd created myself. When I pressed him for support, for the loyalty I'd always given him, he became defensive and then aggressive, accusing me of being manipulative and demanding, of expecting too much from people who were just trying to live their own lives. The conversation ended with him telling me that maybe I needed professional help, that my behavior had been concerning him for months, and that he thought some distance between us would be healthy for both of us. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. 3 days later, I received a registered letter from an attorney representing Marcus. He was filing a restraining order against me, claiming that I'd been harassing him and making threatening statements. The petition included transcripts of conversations I'd supposedly had with him, words I'd never spoken but that sounded plausible enough to be believable. The legal document painted me as unstable and dangerous, someone whose friendship had become a burden and a threat. Reading my own supposed words, seeing my character assassinated in legal language, felt surreal and terrifying. I was losing my grip on reality, unsure what was true anymore, questioning every memory and every relationship. The isolation was complete now. Elena was gone, David had stolen my business, and Marcus had weaponized the legal system against me. My family, poisoned by months of his manipulative phone calls, kept their distance, unsure what to believe but afraid to get too close to whatever drama was consuming my life. The few friends I had left were confused and concerned, but nobody wanted to get involved in what looked like messy personal conflicts. I was alone in ways I'd never imagined possible, surrounded by the wreckage of relationships I'd treasured and a life I'd worked years to build. The financial situation became desperate quickly. Without access to my business accounts and with my personal finances compromised, I struggled to pay basic expenses. The lawyer I'd consulted wanted a substantial retainer that I couldn't afford. My credit score plummeted as mysterious charges appeared on cards I'd thought were secure. Someone had been using my identity to open new accounts, run up debts, and create a financial disaster that would take years to unravel. I applied for emergency identity theft protection, but the process was slow and bureaucratic, offering little immediate relief from the chaos consuming my life. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake at night, replaying every conversation, every shared moment, every instance of trust I'd extended to people who'd been planning my destruction. I analyzed my relationships like a detective examining a crime scene, looking for clues I'd missed, patterns I should have recognized, warning signs I'd ignored. The psychology of betrayal is particularly cruel because it makes you doubt everything, not just the relationship that ended but your ability to judge people, to trust your instincts, to navigate the world safely. Every kindness they'd shown me now felt calculated, every moment of intimacy seemed staged, every shared laugh echoed with mockery I hadn't heard at the time. I wondered how long they'd been planning this, whether they'd ever genuinely cared about me or if I'd been nothing more than a mark from the beginning, a convenient target for their coordinated cruelty. The questions consumed me, spinning through my mind endlessly without resolution or peace. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rachel Martinez, who specialized in trauma recovery and betrayal. Our first session was difficult because I couldn't tell my story without sounding paranoid and delusional, even to myself. The scope of the betrayal was so extensive, so coordinated, that it felt like a conspiracy theory rather than a personal experience. Dr. Martinez listened patiently, taking notes, asking clarifying questions that helped me organize the chaos in my mind into something resembling a coherent narrative. She validated my experiences without judgment, helping me understand that what I'd endured was a form of psychological abuse called organized stalking or coordinated harassment, where multiple people work together to systematically destroy someone's life. Learning there was a name for what had happened to me, that others had survived similar experiences, provided a small measure of comfort in an otherwise dark time. The therapy sessions became my anchor, The 1 hour each week when I could speak truthfully about my experiences without fear of judgment or disbelief. Dr. Martinez helped me understand the psychology of the perpetrators, explaining how some people form what she called toxic alliances where they bond over shared victims, finding meaning and connection through coordinated cruelty. She described it as a form of psychological vampirism where they feed off someone else's destruction, gaining energy and purpose from the suffering they create together. Understanding their motivations didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it helped me realize that their actions reflected their character, not mine. I hadn't been naive or stupid for trusting them. I'd been operating with normal human assumptions about friendship and loyalty that they'd chosen to exploit. The healing process was slow and nonlinear. Some days I felt strong and determined, ready to rebuild my life from the ashes of their destruction. Other days I could barely get out of bed, overwhelmed by the scope of the damage and the energy it would take to recover. Dr. Martinez taught me about the stages of trauma recovery, helping me understand that the ups and downs were normal, that healing wasn't a straight line but a spiral where you revisit the same issues at deeper and deeper levels until they no longer have power over you. I learned meditation and breathing techniques to manage the anxiety that had become a constant companion. I practiced grounding exercises to reconnect with reality when the gaslighting made me doubt my own perceptions. I worked on rebuilding my sense of self-worth, remembering who I was before they began their systematic campaign to make me forget. The financial recovery took longer than the emotional healing. I had to declare bankruptcy to deal with the debts they'd created in my name, a humiliating process that felt like a public admission of failure even though I'd been the victim of crimes. I found work as a freelance consultant, slowly rebuilding my professional reputation while fighting legal battles to reclaim my business and clear my name. The restraining order Marcus had filed was eventually dismissed when I was able to prove that the evidence had been fabricated, but the process took months and cost money I didn't have. Each small victory felt significant because I'd achieved it alone, without the support system I'd once taken for granted. I learned to trust myself again, to listen to my intuition and honor my boundaries, to recognize red flags I'd previously ignored or explained away. The experience taught me the difference between healthy relationships and toxic ones, between people who enhance your life and those who diminish it, between friends who support your growth and those who sabotage your success. I became more selective about who I allowed into my inner circle, but not in a way that closed me off from human connection entirely. Instead, I learned to trust gradually, to observe actions over words, to pay attention to how people treat others rather than just how they treat me. I discovered that real friends don't need access to every corner of your life, don't insist on knowing all your passwords and secrets, don't isolate you from other relationships or make you dependent on their approval. Healthy relationships enhance your sense of self rather than diminish it, inspire you to be your best version rather than make you question your worth, support your independence rather than create dependency. The hardest part of recovery was learning to forgive myself for trusting them, for missing the signs, for being vulnerable with people who used that vulnerability as a weapon. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that forgiveness didn't mean excusing their behavior or pretending the damage hadn't happened, but rather releasing myself from the burden of carrying their poison in my system. Forgiveness was a gift I gave myself, not them, a way of reclaiming my power and refusing to let their cruelty define the rest of my life. I wrote them letters I never sent, expressing all the rage and hurt and disappointment I carried, then ceremonially burned those letters as a way of releasing the negative energy they'd planted in me. I grieved not just for what they'd taken from me but for who I'd thought they were, for the relationships I'd believed in, for the innocence that couldn't be recovered. 18 months after the betrayal began, I received an unexpected phone call from Elena. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my caller ID, but curiosity overcame caution. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, lacking the confidence and coldness I remembered from our last interaction. She asked if we could meet for coffee, said she had things she needed to say, apologies she needed to make. I agreed, though Dr. Martinez and I had discussed this possibility and prepared for it. I chose a public place, brought a friend for support, and went into the meeting with clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss. Elena looked older, tired in a way that seemed to come from more than just physical exhaustion. She apologized, but not in the shallow way I'd expected. Instead, she took full responsibility for her actions, acknowledged the premeditated nature of the betrayal, and explained the psychological dynamics that had led her to participate in something so cruel. She told me that Marcus had been the ringleader, that he'd convinced her and David that I was somehow deserving of punishment, that my success and happiness were built on the suffering of others. She described how he'd gradually recruited them into his campaign against me, starting with small criticisms and building to full-scale character assassination. According to Elena, Marcus had been jealous of my life for years, resentful of opportunities I'd received and achievements I'd earned. He'd convinced her and David that bringing me down was a form of justice, that they were evening the scales of fairness rather than destroying an innocent person. She explained how the group dynamic had made individual moral reasoning more difficult, how they'd reinforced each other's justifications until the cruelty felt righteous. The psychology of mob mentality had allowed them to do things as a group that none of them might have done alone. Elena's explanation didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me understand how ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary cruelty when they're part of a toxic group that validates and encourages their worst impulses. She told me that David had eventually started targeting her as well, that the alliance built on shared cruelty had inevitably turned inward, consuming its own members. Marcus, she said, had become increasingly paranoid and controlling, demanding loyalty while offering none in return. The group had dissolved not because its members developed consciences but because they'd begun victimizing each other, discovering too late that people capable of coordinated betrayal rarely limit their cruelty to outsiders. Elena had fled not out of guilt but out of self-preservation when she realized she'd become David and Marcus's next target. Her apology felt genuine but incomplete, motivated more by her own need for absolution than by concern for the damage she'd helped create. I listened to everything she had to say, then told her I appreciated her honesty but that forgiveness wasn't something I could offer in a coffee shop conversation. The wounds she'd helped create had taken me years to heal, and her explanation, while illuminating, didn't undo the damage or restore what had been lost. I thanked her for the information and left, feeling neither angry nor satisfied but strangely empty, as if a chapter I'd thought was closed had been briefly reopened only to confirm its ending. The conversation with Elena provided closure I hadn't known I needed. Understanding their motivations didn't heal the trauma, but it helped me make sense of experiences that had often felt surreal and inexplicable. I learned that Marcus had indeed been the mastermind, driven by a combination of jealousy, narcissism, and what psychologists call social sadism, the pleasure some people derive from orchestrating group cruelty. David had been motivated primarily by greed, seeing the emotional manipulation as a means to the financial end he'd always planned. Elena's participation had been the most complex, driven by a combination of personal insecurity, desire for belonging, and fear of becoming a target herself if she didn't participate in targeting me. The information helped me understand that I hadn't been randomly chosen but specifically selected because I represented something Marcus couldn't have or be. My contentment with life, my authentic relationships, my professional success, my general optimism, all the things that made me happy had made me a target for someone who couldn't find happiness within himself. The betrayal hadn't been about my flaws or mistakes, but about his inability to tolerate anyone else's light when he was trapped in his own darkness. This realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant the people I'd loved had never really seen me as a person but as a symbol of everything they resented about their own lives. Liberating because it meant their actions reflected their character rather than my worth, their limitations rather than my failures. I could finally stop searching for ways I might have prevented their betrayal, stop blaming myself for trusting people who'd presented themselves as trustworthy, stop carrying responsibility for crimes that had been entirely theirs to own. The recovery process accelerated after that conversation. I'd been carrying questions that kept me tethered to the past, and getting answers, however painful, allowed me to fully release what had already ended. I threw myself into rebuilding my life with renewed energy, focusing on relationships that nourished rather than depleted me, work that aligned with my values rather than just my financial needs, activities that brought me joy rather than just pastime. I started volunteering with organizations that helped other victims of psychological abuse and financial exploitation, finding meaning in my suffering by using it to help others navigate similar experiences. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, providing a sense of purpose that transcended my personal healing. I met other survivors who'd endured coordinated betrayals, organized harassment campaigns, and systematic gaslighting, and our shared experiences created bonds stronger than the friendships I'd lost. These new relationships were built on mutual understanding rather than shared history, on present-moment authenticity rather than nostalgic attachment, on conscious choice rather than circumstantial proximity. I learned to appreciate the quality of relationships over their quantity, to value depth over breadth, substance over surface. I discovered that being alone was preferable to being surrounded by people who diminished my spirit, that solitude could be peaceful rather than lonely when it wasn't imposed by others' cruelty. I developed new interests, explored parts of myself that had been suppressed or neglected during the years when my energy went toward managing toxic relationships. I took art classes, learned to rock climb, traveled to places I'd always wanted to visit but had never prioritized. I created a life that was authentically mine rather than a performance designed to win others' approval or avoid their punishment. The person who emerged from the ashes of that betrayal was stronger than the one who'd been destroyed, more discerning but not more cynical, more careful but not more closed, more independent but not more isolated. I learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were before trauma but about integrating the experience into a new version of yourself that's wiser without being bitter, more cautious without being fearful. 3 years have passed since the betrayal began, and I can honestly say that while I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, I'm grateful for who it helped me become. The person writing these words is more authentic than the one who existed before, more aligned with her own values, more selective about the energy she invests and the people she trusts. I learned that some people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when it serves their purposes, but I also learned that I'm capable of extraordinary resilience when circumstances demand it. I discovered that my capacity to love deeply hasn't been destroyed by their betrayal but refined by it, that my ability to trust hasn't been eliminated but educated by experience. I still form close relationships, but now I do so with eyes wide open, paying attention to actions rather than words, noticing how people treat others rather than just how they treat me, observing their character in small moments rather than just grand gestures. I've learned to trust my instincts even when others question them, to honor my boundaries even when others challenge them, to prioritize my well-being even when others call it selfish. The scars from their betrayal are still visible if you know where to look, but they're no longer wounds that bleed at the slightest touch. They've become part of my landscape, reminders of battles I've survived and strength I didn't know I possessed. I trusted them with everything, and they shattered me completely, But from those shattered pieces I built something new, something that couldn't be broken in the same way again. The greatest revenge isn't punishment but recovery, not destruction but recreation, not bitterness but the kind of peace that comes from knowing you can survive anything and still choose love, still choose hope, still choose to remain open to life's possibilities even after experiencing its worst betrayals. I am living proof that trust can be rebuilt, that hearts can heal, that people can emerge from coordinated cruelty more whole than they were before it began.